I miss my son. His birthday is about to come up, which he would be 30, and it's hard. And he ain't gonna never walk through the door. It's like living it all over again.
The force of impact caused massive internal hemorrhaging and destroyed his organs from the inside.
Actions taken sometimes end up being a cycle. I do something to you, now you're gonna do something to me.
I believe that she put all the anger from every fight that her son ever had in his life, or every time he got beat up, into one person.
The cost of revenge in this case, I think, is beyond reckoning.
At 4 p.m., police in Elgin, Illinois, received multiple emergency calls from an apartment complex.
Our shift had just started, and the first of a series of 911 calls came in related to a hit and run involving a child. At least initially, that's how it was described.
Callers were frantically seeking help for a teenage boy who had been struck by a vehicle in the parking lot. Dispatchers can hear the chaos and commotion going on, and they immediately send emergency vehicles to the scene.
When they arrive, they find a young man lying on the ground, covered in blood.
There was at least 10 people, if not more, around the victim, screaming, yelling, trying to talk to the officers. And as the officers got there, they had to try to make sense of what happened, who did this, and get as much of this information out as fast as possible while also rendering any kind of first aid and help to the victim.
Residents identified the victim as 17-year-old John Keys, who lives in the building with his mother.
Paramedics realized that Keys' injuries are extremely severe, and he is rushed to Sherman Hospital.
Massive amount of damages to the inside of his body, to his organs, to his spine, to his pelvis area.
The severity of the impact becomes immediately clear. There's tire marks that are leading toward the point of impact. There's pieces of the car, there's headlight assemblies, bumper parts laying everywhere, and a large electrical box had been moved 5 inches off of its mooring.
Considering that the damage that was done on the building and the serious injuries suffered by the victim, you're talking a car maybe going 20, 30 miles an hour.
It's pretty obvious that Keys was struck with a tremendous amount of force.
John W. Keys III, known as Little John, was born in Chicago, Illinois on July 8, 1992. The youngest of 5 children raised by Dion Harris and John Keys Jr.
I was overwhelmed, joy, real excited, because he was my first boy, and I wanted a boy for many, many years.
We wound up with 4 girls, but at that point, we were both saying, hey, this is enough, okay? I love my kids, but we had to slow down. But when I got Lil John, it was just everything to me.
From the beginning, Little John was outgoing and eager to keep up with his older siblings.
My very first memory of us is when we were younger. I was about 5 or 6. John was probably 10, 11 months at the time, and we were playing hide and go seek, and I tried to hide from the seeker, and I jumped on John, and I broke his leg. So he was crawling around with the cast on his first birthday.
He used to drag that leg and go everywhere he needed to go, stairs and all. It did not stop him. Always running, always smiling. That's just how he was. He was my boy. I just let him have his way. Whatever he wanted to do, whatever he wanted to go, he always got to do that.
I'm gonna say that he was spoiled. He got more. So he had his own room and his own space and his own toys.
Little John's parents had been high school sweethearts, but after 16 years together, they'd begun to grow apart.
We was happy for a long time, but John's was out in the street a lot, so I wasn't happy with that.
I was a lot better father than I was husband, unfortunately. Between the womanizing and the running the street and stuff like that, she just pretty much got tired of it.
They eventually separated, and Dion took the children to live in nearby Elgin, Illinois. She officially filed for divorce in 2000.
I think Lil John was around 8 or 9 when she and I split up. Kind of hit him hard.
I felt like he was a little bit more hurt because he was the only boy and my dad was the only other man in the house. So when he left, he was like, I'm the man of the house. He didn't want to be like our little brother anymore. He just wants to be himself.
For Little John, being himself meant following in his father's footsteps.
He was always with me every other weekend. We had our classes here and there, but that was my best friend in the world. Me and Lil John was 2 peas in a pod.
When he started getting like to 7th grade, he started getting interested in young ladies. But I used to tell him that comes with a job. You're not old enough right now. I told him, how you have a girlfriend and you can't buy nothing or do anything for her. And he like, well, I'm gonna get a job and I'm gonna help you around the house. You can pay me to get something, to get a gift.
He was a hustler. He knew how to get money. We rake lawns and shovel snow and things like that. He's a hustler, he's getting money, and he's doing it the right way.
By the time he was 17, Little John had more girlfriends than he knew what to do with.
A lot of girls liked him, you know, because he was a handsome dude.
He transformed himself into this guy that had money and he had the persona, he had the clothes, the look. And so he said, no, I'm not Little John, I'm King Cash. I believe that the attention that my brother started to receive at such a young age definitely blew up his ego to the point where he's like, oh, well, all these girls like me? Well, I'm gonna make sure my hair's always cut and my clothes are always clean, shoes are always clean, and I'm gonna look good, and I'll get even more women.
But for Little John, more women meant trouble.
With the girls that like him, it's always a jealous boyfriend or a jealous ex, and he wasn't the type to back down. Even if he just had met the girl, he'd be like, she over here with me now.
Sometimes the other guys made it physical.
He would just beat him up, and he got suspended for it. I was like, well, he know how to fight. That's one thing his dad taught him, how to fight.
He was just like me. He didn't go around, he didn't start fights, but he didn't back down an inch. You know, if you brought it to him, he's gonna meet the challenge.
The constant fighting eventually got him expelled.
After you get into a certain amount of trouble at the regular schools, they'll send you to an alternative school. And so they sent my brother to Central because of the behavioral. They try to say he had behavioral issues.
He only went maybe 2 weeks, and they called me from there. The principal was like, he don't need to be here. Do I have the money to take him to get the GED? Because he's too advanced to be here. He don't need what we teaching.
In late October 2009, Little John began making plans to move to Indianapolis to be with his father and get his GED.
He called me and told me, Dad, I'm ready to come back down here. And we sat there on the phone and we made a plan about what was gonna be done when he got back down there. You know, you continue to get your GED. I'm gonna help you find a job, and you're gonna, you know, things gonna get better. He knew I was gonna be his support group.
He definitely had dreams of going to college and getting some form of business degree, and he wanted to be a businessman.
Just 2 weeks later, those plans would be shattered. Now, Little John is clinging to life after being struck by a car, and police want to know why.
The witnesses are in shock, and the police officers have to try to gather more information so that we can find out who did this.
The callers didn't really know if this was intentional or accidental at the time. There was an immense pressure on them to find a person who did it.
As EMTs rushed 17-year-old hit-and-run victim Little John Keys to the hospital, police in Elgin, Illinois began piecing together what happened.
When they examined the impact scene, there was blood on the outside wall to include paint transfer from the vehicle at the point of impact. They also found tire tracks in the direction of the impact to show from the direction that the person was driving towards the victim.
One of the witnesses is a 17-year-old girl who tells investigators she watched the tragedy unfold from her apartment.
It was unseasonably warm and the window was open at the time. The girl saw John Keys, also known as Little John, down in the parking lot.
She said that she had called out to him, he didn't hear her, but she continued to look out the window, and at that time she had observed a blue vehicle entering the area, and the vehicle proceeds right at Little John.
The blue car proceeds to jump a curb, hits Keys from behind, and sends him flying face and chest first into this electrical box and into the side of the apartment building.
And according to the witness, it quickly became clear it wasn't an accident.
The girl says the blue car backs up, and as Keys crumples to the ground, another green vehicle pulls up. She sees a woman get out of the blue car, but instead of going to check on Keys to make sure he's okay, she says, "Y'all mess him up," or something to that effect. At this point, men get out of the green vehicle, one of them carrying a baseball bat. The girl says one of the men went up to Keys, struck him on the head, and said, "Talk trash now."
The witness says when it was over, the assailants fled. At that point, she called 911.
A lot of times when someone witnesses a traumatic event, it's such thing that really shakes them. They can recall some details, but when you think about how this emotionally impacted the 17-year-old, I mean, here she is, she sees a friend of hers who is, at this point, she believes, severely injured.
Word of the tragic assault travels fast.
Lil John's girlfriend called me. She called and said, Lil John been hit by a car. And I'm like, what? And I was like, okay, I'm on my way. I beat them to Sherman Hospital. When I got there, they was pulling Lil John out of the ambulance.
Within moments, her worst fears are confirmed.
I knew there wasn't no life in him. My mind went blank. I couldn't think. I only thought of one phone number. My friend Darlene, I called her phone and told her, Lil John gone. And she said, gone where? I said, he's gone. He passed away.
So I was literally in traffic when I got the call that my brother was murdered, and I could not move. I physically was stuck in Chicago traffic, and there was nothing that I could do but scream, scream, yell, cry. And my aunt's right there, and I could tell she was trying to be, like strong, but she was crying too.
Little John's family gathers at the hospital.
Seeing my brother laid there with just one drop of blood, he still had a smile on his face, so I don't know if he was running and laughing at the same time, but I could never get his face out of my head. Me and his girlfriend went in there and we both gave him a kiss on the forehead. And that was that.
Authorities are now investigating a homicide, and Little John's friends think they know one of the people responsible.
Detectives continued their neighborhood canvass, and they were able to determine that LaCorbic Binion did, in fact, hit John Keys with the baseball bat. Another witness recognizes the young man with the baseball bat.
Just a few hours after Little John Keys was run over and beaten to death, a witness thinks she can identify one of the suspects involved. 16-year-old LaCorbic Binion.
LaCorbic Binion is another student at Larkin. We went to school together. Prior to everything that happened with my brother, he was okay. He was cool. We would speak in the hallways. He wasn't as outgoing as my brother, who would go talk to anybody and try to get any girl. I do not believe that they knew each other. Never hung out, didn't run in the same crowd.
According to the witness, Little John and LaCorbic crossed paths at the same party the night before. It didn't go well.
The story that I got from my brother, Lil John's girlfriend, was that my brother was dancing with a girl, and the girl was LaCorbic's girlfriend. And LaCorbic did not like that, and so he pushed my brother. My brother reacted and hit him in the face.
When my son called his balance, he walked up to him and hit him across the eye, and his eye started bleeding. And he was like, "Your girl asked to dance with me, what you pushing me for?" But when my son seen the blood, they said he took off running because there was so much blood, it scared him.
He wasn't trying to beat him or hurt him too bad. He pushed him, he hit him once, and that was that.
When investigators speak to Little John's family, they confirm the story. They say at the time, it didn't seem like anything to be concerned about.
11 or 12 at night, he was like, "Sis, they kicked me out the party." And I was like, "For what?" And he was like, "Cause I was dancing with this dude's girlfriend and he pushed me, so I hit him." And I was like, "You okay?" And he was just like, "Yeah, I'm good." He didn't seem like, "Oh, I just got into a world of mess" or anything like that. It was just basically a altercation between two teenage boys.
I just heard that he was at the party and the girl was dancing on him. The next day, he's dead.
If LaCorbic was the one with the bat, police need to find him, the others in the green car with him, and the driver of the blue car that hit Little John. Soon, Sergeant Trost's keen eye gives them their next good lead.
I was sitting at the Price Right liquor store gas station, and as I'm sitting there watching traffic going westbound, I heard this thump, 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 which sounded to me like a flat tire, and I see this older vehicle pulls right into the gas station.
The car is a blue 1991 Chrysler Imperial, and the damage to its front end immediately makes Sergeant Trost suspicious.
And I observed 3 people standing at the driver's side door of this vehicle. An older female, a younger female, and then a male juvenile. All 3 of them, I knew right away they had been through some sort of trauma at that point. I just didn't know exactly what it was. Now they start walking away. Instead of going into the gas station or even approaching me if they had a problem, they start walking away from me. And I exit my vehicle and I get out and I say that, hey, we just had a report of an accident up the street and I'd like to, talk to you. The other younger woman, probably about 19 or so, appeared to have some kind of injury, some facial injuries. So I requested an ambulance.
While they await the paramedics, Trost spots a harrowing detail on the car.
It appeared to have some kind of damage to it, and there was no way you could not mistake the amount of blood that was on that vehicle.
And suddenly, a shocking confession.
Tamara Branch, the older female who was the driver of the vehicle, says, "I hit that boy."
According to witnesses, 2 vehicles were involved in the hit-and-run murder of little John Keys. The blue car that ran him over, and a green car carrying 16-year-old LeCorbic Binion, the boy who allegedly beat him. Police are still looking for LeCorbic. But after a traffic stop, the driver of the blue car has made a spontaneous confession.
With her comment to me, now I know that this changes more from just an initial stop to an actual criminal investigation that, can be quite serious. Because if I were to continue questioning her, I would have to ensure that I Mirandized her. So at this point, I didn't ask any questions of her. And I requested for an additional unit.
Wherever there's a murder investigation in Illinois, you have to have a videotaped interrogation of the murder suspect. It has to be videotaped. So, they needed to bring her back to the station to get her on tape, basically.
That doesn't stop the suspect from talking, however. She identifies herself as 33-year-old Tamara Branch.
She had overheard the radio content of having a show-up witnesses come see the vehicle, etc. And she made a statement to the effect of, there's no reason for that, and again stated, I hit that boy, and we'll let the judge sort it out.
Detectives looked into her background and history, and they didn't find that much. She was a mother of 3, lived in nearby Streamwood, and worked at a large department store. The only thing she had on her record were minor traffic offenses.
There was no violence in her background. It's what makes the investigation even more difficult, trying to understand why someone's going to do something like this.
Still not in the recorded interrogation, she offers a direct explanation.
She readily admitted that she ran down little John because her son, LeCorbic Binion, had been bullied by him.
Tamara told police officers that she believed that her son, LeCorbic, had been picked on and bullied at school. I think that she went after John Keys in an effort to pay him back for what he had done to her son LeCorbic the night before. And she was going to teach LeCorbic a lesson and how to stand up for himself.
And she even asked at one point, "What would you do?"
But as questioning heats up, she delivers a wildly abrupt change to her story.
After police began asking her questions about her front end damage, she claimed that it was from a previous incident. Police also questioned her about whether or not she knew John Keys, but she said she didn't. She also said that she was just in the area meeting somebody and had no idea where the blood came from on her front bumper.
In essence, she denied absolutely everything in the taped interview. She denied the incident between her son and little John that had occurred the night before also.
Watching the video of her in Elgin police custody, you could look at her and tell that she was making up stories. Oh, my car had already had an accident and, it just stopped right there. So I was just going to walk and leave it and go get somebody to help me come back and get it. She lied continuously, didn't drop a tear, no remorse, no nothing.
She probably realized how serious it was and began to try to minimize her role in the entire situation, just as a defense mechanism. But the physical evidence, the witnesses, everything was there.
Police arrest Tamara and charge her with first-degree murder. But without her confession, they'll need more to prove she did it.
Police at this point are just trying to shore up their evidence. But there's, plenty of other eyewitnesses and physical evidence, that's readily available.
Tamara's son, LeCorbic, is still nowhere to be found. The next day, on November 8th, investigators track down his girlfriend to see what she can tell them. When they get to the girl's house, they're met by her father instead. He assures them she had nothing to do with Little John's death. And the reason he knows is because he was in the green car.
So at this party the night before, where John Keyes had struck LaCorbic, LaCorbic's girlfriend was there. LaCorbic's girlfriend's parents got there, and the father ended up taking LaCorbic to the hospital.
On the way to the hospital, he overheard a conversation between LaCorbic and Tamara.
Tamara expressed frustration and anger. She stated that her son had been subject to continued bullying, and she felt that the time was now that he needed to stand up for himself against this.
Tamara told LaCorbic, "I'm sick of you being a little B-word, and I'm gonna teach you how to go in on somebody."
The investigation into the murder of Little John Keyes is only a few hours old, and police already have a suspect in custody, 33-year-old Tamara Branch. Now they're getting a clearer picture of what happened from one of the men who were there.
The father of Tamara's son's girlfriend stated Tamara was emotional, was upset, related to the fact that her son was being bullied and that this incident had occurred the night before where her son got injured by Little John.
So Sunday, she woke her son up to come and fight my child. She told her son, "You ain't gonna be no punk. You gonna fight him today. You ain't gonna keep letting people bully you." And the son didn't want to fight, but she forced him.
The father says he agreed to take LaCorbic to confront Little John. 2 other boys came with them.
He stated Tamara found information about where Little John was and that he agreed to go along to keep things from, in his words, from getting out of hand.
The man says he followed Tamara to Little John's apartment building, but when they got there, she decided to take matters into her own hands.
I don't think that Tamara probably planned to hit him with the car, to crush him with the car, until she saw him in that instant, decided that she was going to use her car as a weapon against John.
She had it in her head that her son was no longer gonna take this, and she was gonna be the person to show him, this is how you get revenge.
This is how she went to get payback for a teenage fistfight. This is how you respond.
But Tamara still wasn't satisfied. With Little John unconscious and bleeding on the ground, she ordered her son to finish the job.
Tamara's son exits the vehicle with the baseball bat and at the direction of Tamara proceeds to strike Little John, who is clearly severely injured, with the baseball bat several times.
To hear that he got out afterwards to try to hit my brother's body at that point, I was furious. Because I knew this kid, and it's like, you don't have the balls yourself, and you thought that that was the moment that you needed to get back at him when he was already hit by a car and possibly dead.
After the incident, they immediately re-entered their vehicles and exited from the scene as fast as they could.
An autopsy confirms investigators' suspicions. Little John could not have survived his injuries from the crash, no matter what happened afterwards.
The Kane County coroner did their investigation related to this, and the findings included the fact that he had severe damage to his pelvic area, broken bones, and a severed major artery, which caused massive bleeding, which all proved to be fatal.
Regardless of what LeCorbic had done with the baseball bat at the scene, John Keyes was, for all intents and purposes, dead at the scene. He was not going to make it. So there was absolutely nothing that LeCorbic did that would have changed, that would have made it worse.
Investigators are also able to obtain surveillance footage that shows the two vehicles leaving the scene.
Tamara got back in her car, backed it up, drove out of the parking lot, and drove down the street about a block to this gas station convenience store, all the while leaving a trail of automobile fluid, oil, antifreeze, that sort of thing along the road. You can see the damage to the front of the car. You can see the damage to the tire and wheel well.
Armed with this new witness statement and the evidence collected at the crime scene, prosecutors believe they have a strong enough case to go to trial.
Given the information that's available, it's very reasonable to conclude that Tamara had sought out where little John was, created a plan and how to deal with him, and set it into motion, which is, a cold and calculating conspiracy that she created here to go after this young boy.
4 months later, on March 23, 2010, a grand jury decides to indict LeCorbic Binion for first-degree murder.
LeCorbic had gone with some family members down to Arkansas and was no longer in the Elgin area by the time we got around to charging him.
He's arrested without incident in Arkansas and taken back to Illinois to face trial.
There were witnesses who said that he got out of the car and he had a bat. There were witnesses who said he then took a couple of swings at Jonathan. You can't just be out doing vigilanteism. Should LeCorbic have been struck the night before? No. But there's ways that needs to be handled by the police, by the judicial system. You don't do payback on your own.
Authorities in Elgin, Illinois, have charged 2 people for the murder of little John Keyes, 16-year-old LeCorbic Binion and his mother, Tamara Branch. Witnesses say it was a coordinated act of revenge for a fist fight between the 2 boys.
They said that the boy pushed him, and that's why he punched him. They like, yeah, LeCorbic had to go to the hospital, so that's why his mom came and ran him over. And I'm like confused, like, okay, your son got into a fight, and you come and run down a kid? Are you okay? Like, I couldn't wrap my head around that.
In August 2011, Tamara's trial finally begins.
In Illinois, you don't even need an intent to kill. If you just have an intent to cause them great bodily harm and what you do to them causes the death, you can be guilty of first-degree murder.
The witnesses in the other car with LeCorbic aren't charged with anything, but one of the passengers testifies to Tamara's state of mind.
He had overheard how Tamara was explaining how upset she was and how she was, in essence, fed up with the bullying that her son was receiving. She put together a group to go after this person. And ultimately what happened is she committed murder.
Tamara pleads not guilty and, in a surprising move, forgoes her right to a jury. Instead, she opts to leave her fate in the hands of the judge.
I think the defense strategy was pretty clear. They opted for a bench trial before Judge Alan Anderson in King County, and their main thrust was arguing that Branch was, she was guilty. Not of first-degree murder, but of second-degree murder.
She kept on the stand crying and saying like she just wanted people to stop messing with her son, but my brother didn't go to your school with your son. My brother didn't know your son, so the fact that you're trying to play like, oh, I just wanted to protect him, like, get that out of here. Like, no, you were upset because he got beat up and then you did what you wanted to do.
But prosecutors aren't buying her story.
It was clear to me that while she knew what she had done was wrong, that she did not want to accept legal responsibility for the acts that she had perpetrated upon John Keyes by killing him in such a brutal and heinous way. Second-degree murder is when you commit first-degree murder, but you do it under a sudden and intense passion. Her son having been punched is not a serious provocation under Illinois law.
I believe that she put all the anger from every fight that her son ever had in his life, or every time he got beat up, into one person. And that just unfortunately happened to be my brother.
On November 9th, 2011, the judge finds Tamara guilty and sentences her to 34 years in prison.
I do not feel like that's justifiable. My brother could never come back. You know, he's gone for having a fight with your son. So that's nothing. I feel like you get more time for selling dope than murder. And that's just the way this world is.
30 years? Come on now, not enough time. I believe they should have been 50 plus, minimum 50.
The following year, in May of 2012, Tamara's son LeCorbic decides not to go to trial. Instead, he pleads guilty to a reduced charge.
The plea offer that we offered to LeCorbic, we offered to amend the charge to a conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, which is a lower charge, obviously, than first-degree murder.
As I get older, I had to put myself in his shoes as a 16-year-old kid, and your mom is telling you, go him up, go do it. I don't think I would have had the strength to deny my mom or tell her no. If that was what was happening at the time, I believe I would have did what my mom told me to do.
We also took into account the motive and who was the one who had instigated this crime, and that was definitely LeCorbic's mother, Tamara. And we also took into account LeCorbic's young age. So he was not the one that was the principal. He was kind of being pushed into this and really kind of being bullied into it by his mother at that point in time. We offered him to be sentenced to 15 years in prison. He was required to serve 7.5 years of that.
LeCorbic Binion was released after serving his sentence.
I was strolling through Facebook one day, and the people you may know, his picture, it just, the way it felt in my stomach, it just, like, I hurried up and blocked this so I could never see that again. Like, it just does something else to me that I didn't even know was there.
Tamara Branch is serving out her sentence at the Logan Correctional Center in Lincoln, Illinois. She is eligible for parole in 2043 at the age of 71.
As a parent myself, it hurts to see your child or your children suffer, and you want to protect them in any way you can, but cooler heads need to prevail, and violence does not solve anything, ever.
There's a man upstairs called God that I lean on him every day. And I just ask for strength to get me through it, but I hurt every day. I miss my son. His birthday is about to come up, which he would be 30.
On a warm July evening in Calgary, Alberta, a 5-year-old girl was somewhere she should never have been without her mother. Her name was Talia Marsman. She was 5 years old enough to recognize familiar faces, old enough to know the comfort of her mother's presence, but still far too young to understand the danger that was closing around her. Her mother was Sarah Bailey, 34 years old. For the people who knew them, Sarah and Talia were not two names that belonged to a future crime scene. They were a mother and daughter. They were a pair. One life moving alongside another. But on July 12, 2016, that ordinary connection was suddenly broken. Sarah disappeared. And Talia disappeared with her. First, there was no body. No dramatic crime scene surrounded by police tape. No obvious explanation. There was simply an absence. A woman who should have been somewhere was not there. A little girl who should have been with her mother was not there either. And in those first hours before the full horror became visible, There was still room for hope. Maybe Sarah had gone somewhere unexpectedly. Maybe her phone was off. Maybe there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe Talia was safe. That is the cruel thing about the beginning of a missing person investigation. The mind naturally reaches for ordinary explanations because ordinary explanations are easier to survive. But investigators have to think differently. They have to look at the details that family members desperately want to dismiss. Who saw Sarah last? Where had she been? Who had access to her? Where was Talia? Was the child with her? Was someone else involved? And perhaps the most frightening question of all, if Sarah had disappeared against her will, where was her daughter? Calgary was still going about its business while those questions began to spread through the city. Cars moved through familiar streets. People went to work. Families made dinner. Children went to bed. And somewhere inside that same city, investigators were beginning to understand that they might not be searching for one missing person. They might be searching for two. The case would soon become one of the most disturbing investigations Calgary had seen in years. Because Sarah Bailey would not be coming home. And Talia Marsman would not be coming home either. But at the beginning nobody knew that. At the beginning there was only uncertainty. And uncertainty can be its own kind of torture. For a family waiting for answers, every passing hour creates another possibility. Every unanswered phone call becomes heavier. Every unfamiliar vehicle outside the house catches the eye. Every knock at the door carries the possibility of relief or devastation. Then the first terrible answer came. Sarah Bailey was found dead. The missing person investigation became a homicide investigation. And suddenly the question surrounding Talia changed. She was no longer simply a missing child. She was a 5-year-old girl whose mother had been murdered. That distinction changed everything. Investigators now had to work against the clock. If someone had killed Sarah and Talia was still alive, where was the child? If the same person had taken Talia, what did they intend to do with her? How far away could she be? How long had she been with that person? Was she frightened? Was she injured? Was she waiting somewhere for her mother to return, without understanding that her mother never would? Those questions were not theoretical. They were the questions that investigators had to carry while they searched. The photograph of Talia became familiar to people across Calgary. Her young face appeared in public appeals as authorities urged anyone with information to come forward. 5 years old. A little girl whose disappearance had now become the center of an increasingly desperate search. For the public there was still hope. Hope that someone had seen her. Hope that someone had recognized her. Hope that she was alive. But investigators were already looking backward. They had to reconstruct Sarah's final hours. Every location mattered. Every relationship mattered. Every phone call mattered. Every vehicle that could have crossed her path mattered. A seemingly insignificant detail could become the thread that unraveled the entire case. And as investigators pulled at those threads, a name would eventually begin to emerge. Edward Downey. First, a name is only a name. But in a homicide investigation, a name can become something else. It can become a doorway, person of interest, a potential explanation, a connection between separate pieces of evidence that previously seemed unrelated. Downey was not a stranger to the criminal justice system. His background and connections would become relevant as investigators examined the circumstances surrounding Sarah's death and Talia's disappearance. But police could not simply point to a troubled history and declare someone responsible. A homicide investigation requires more than suspicion. It requires proof. It requires evidence that can survive scrutiny. And this investigation would eventually turn toward forensic evidence, including DNA. That evidence would become one of the crucial elements in the case against Downey. But before the courtroom, before the verdict, before the sentence, there was something much more immediate. There was a child missing. For several days, the search continued. Every hour carried a terrible tension. The investigators had already lost Sarah. They were still looking for Talia. And until the child was found, there was still a possibility that this story could end differently. That possibility is important. Because when people later remember cases like this, they often remember the ending first. They remember the bodies. They remember the arrest. They remember the courtroom. They remember the sentence. But investigators do not experience a case in that order. They experience it one clue at a time, one unanswered question at a time, one terrible discovery followed by another. For the people searching for Talia, the case was not yet a completed story. It was a race. A race against distance. A race against time. A race against whatever had happened after Sarah disappeared. Then on July 15th, the search reached a devastating conclusion. Talia was found in a rural area near Calgary. She was dead. The hope that had surrounded the search disappeared in an instant. The little girl whose photograph had been shared across the community would never be brought home alive. She was 5 years old. And now investigators had 2 deaths to explain. 2 victims. 1 mother. 1 child. And somewhere between the place where Sarah had been found and the rural location where Talia was discovered, was a sequence of events that investigators needed to reconstruct. That sequence would become the heart of the prosecution's case. How did Sarah and Talia come into contact with Edward Downey? What happened to Sarah? What happened to Talia? How did the evidence connect Downey to them? And most importantly, what had happened during those final hours when a mother and her 5-year-old daughter disappeared from the ordinary world? The answers would eventually emerge through forensic examination, witness information, surveillance, digital evidence, and the painstaking work of investigators. But those answers would never erase the most painful fact. Sarah Bailey was 34 years old. Talia Marsman was 5. Before they became the subjects of a homicide investigation, they were simply a mother and daughter living their lives. There were ordinary moments that never appeared in police reports. There were conversations nobody recorded. There were meals, routines, plans, family memories, small childhood moments that seemed insignificant at the time. There was a little girl who had no idea that the adults around her would eventually be trying to reconstruct the last hours of her life. And there was a mother whose final moments would become evidence. A photograph. A phone record. A location. A forensic trace. A name. A timeline. Pieces of a life transformed into pieces of an investigation. That is one of the darkest realities of a homicide case. The victim's life is eventually reduced, in the language of police work, to evidence. But Sarah was more than evidence. Talia was more than evidence. They were people. And that distinction matters. Because the story of Sarah Bailey and Talia Marsman is not ultimately a story about how an investigation defeated a suspect. It is a story about 2 lives that were taken. It is a story about a mother who disappeared and a child who vanished with her. It is a story about a city that waited for a little girl to come home. And it is a story about how, piece by piece, investigators began to understand that the disappearance they were investigating was something far more sinister than they had first hoped. On July 12th, the question was, where are Sarah and Talia? A few days later, the question became, who killed them? And once that question was asked, there was no going back. Because somewhere inside the evidence was the answer. Somewhere in the timeline was the moment when Sarah's life ended. Somewhere after that was the moment when Talia's short life ended too. And somewhere between those moments was a man whose name would become permanently connected to theirs. Edward Downey. The investigation would eventually lead police to him. The evidence would eventually lead him into a courtroom. And a jury would eventually be asked to decide whether the man sitting before them was responsible for the deaths of a mother and her 5-year-old daughter. But before the courtroom came the search. Before the search came the disappearance. And before the disappearance there was something much more fragile. There was an ordinary life. A mother. A daughter. A summer day in Calgary. And a future that, until that moment, still seemed to belong to them. They did not know that their names would soon be spoken together in news reports. They did not know that strangers would search for Talia's face. They did not know that investigators would spend countless hours reconstructing their final movements. They did not know that forensic scientists would examine traces left behind after their deaths. And they certainly did not know that their story would end with a courtroom, a conviction, and a life sentence. At the beginning, there was only a disappearance. A mother was gone. Her little girl was gone. And for a brief, agonizing period, the people searching for them could still believe that somewhere beyond the fear, There might be a way to bring them both home. That hope would not survive. But before it disappeared, an entire city would search for a 5-year-old girl. And before the case was over, investigators would uncover the evidence that would transform 2 missing persons into the victims of a double murder. This is the story of Sarah Bailey and Talia Marsman. And it begins with the moment nobody yet understood how much had already been lost. By the time the first reports began to circulate through Calgary, the case had already taken on a different shape. At first, it was a missing person investigation. Then Sarah Bailey was found dead. And that single discovery changed the meaning of everything that had come before it. A missing woman could have meant many things. A woman could have left voluntarily. She could have gone somewhere without telling anyone. There could have been a misunderstanding, a personal crisis, an unexpected journey. But a dead woman changed the equation. Now investigators knew that a violent crime had occurred. And there was still a 5-year-old girl whose whereabouts were unknown. Talia Marsman. Her name became the name at the center of the search. For investigators, the situation was brutally simple. Whatever had happened to Sarah, Talia was still missing. Every possibility had to remain open. She could have been with someone she knew. She could have been somewhere completely unrelated to the place where her mother was found. She could have been frightened and unable to tell anyone who she was. Or she could have been in the hands of the person responsible for Sarah's death. That last possibility was the one no investigator could afford to ignore. When a child disappears under circumstances connected to a homicide, time becomes more than a number on a clock. Time becomes evidence. The longer a person remains missing, the more opportunities there are for evidence to disappear. A vehicle can move. A phone can be switched off. A camera recording can overwrite itself. A witness can forget a detail. A trail can become colder. And if the child is in danger, every minute matters for reasons that have nothing to do with the investigation itself. Somewhere there was a little girl. Somewhere there were questions she could not answer. Somewhere investigators needed to find her. The search for Talia expanded. Police examined the places connected to Sarah. They looked at where she had been, who she had known, what movements could be established, and which people might have information that had not yet been revealed. Investigators began pulling together the fragments of Sarah's final hours. This is the point in a homicide investigation where ordinary life begins to look strangely suspicious. A door that had been opened, a vehicle that had been seen, a phone that had gone silent, a person who could not immediately account for where they had been, a conversation that seemed meaningless when it happened but suddenly became important after a death. Every detail had to be reconsidered. Because the investigators were no longer trying simply to find a missing mother and daughter. They were trying to reconstruct a crime. And reconstruction is rarely clean. There is no single camera angle that shows the entire truth. There is no narrator standing beside the victim, explaining what happened. Instead, there are fragments. A witness remembers something. A forensic technician finds something else. A surveillance recording provides another piece. A phone record establishes a time. A vehicle places someone somewhere. DNA creates a physical connection. Individually, each piece may seem incomplete. Together, they can become devastating. But before those pieces could be assembled, there was a more urgent task. Find Talia. The public appeal surrounding her disappearance carried a painful simplicity. Her photograph showed a child. Not a suspect. Not a mystery. Not a symbol. A child. A 5-year-old who should have been protected by the adults around her. People who had never met Sarah or Talia were suddenly looking at the little girl's face, wondering whether they might have passed her somewhere. They looked at photographs. They listened to descriptions. They paid attention to vehicles. They watched the news. They waited for another announcement from police. And as the hours passed, the emotional atmosphere surrounding the investigation changed. Hope was still there. But fear was growing alongside it. For Talia's family, those hours must have carried an unbearable contradiction. They needed to believe she was alive. At the same time, the discovery of Sarah made it impossible to ignore the possibility that Talia was also in grave danger. Hope and fear could exist in the same room. They could exist in the same sentence. They could exist in the same breath. Please let her be alive. Please let her be somewhere safe. Please let someone find her. Those are the thoughts that can consume a family during a missing child investigation. There is no normal waiting. There is no ordinary silence. A phone ringing can feel like salvation. A phone not ringing can feel like another hour slipping away. And for investigators, the pressure is different but no less intense. They have to keep moving. They cannot allow emotion to determine the direction of the investigation. They have to follow evidence even when the evidence leads somewhere painful. They have to question people who may be innocent. They have to consider possibilities that families may not want to hear. They have to examine relationships. And they have to ask a question that can feel almost cruel to say aloud. Who might have had a reason to hurt Sarah? Then another question follows. Who might have had access to Talia? The investigation began to narrow. One name would become increasingly important. Edward Downey. Downey had a criminal background, and investigators began examining his connection to the case. But a criminal history does not make someone guilty of a particular crime. That distinction is essential. Investigators needed evidence. They needed something stronger than suspicion. They needed something that could connect Downey to the physical reality of what had happened. That evidence would eventually include forensic findings. But before the case reached that stage, investigators still had to find Talia. And on July 15th, the search ended in the worst possible way. The 5-year-old girl was found dead in a rural area near Calgary. For those who had spent days hoping for a different outcome, this was the moment the last possibility disappeared. Talia was not coming home. She was 5 years old. Her life had barely begun. The photographs that had been circulated in the search were no longer photographs of a missing child, who might walk back into the arms of her family. They had become part of the public memory of a little girl, whose life had been violently taken away. The investigation now had a second homicide. And with that came an entirely new set of questions. What had happened to Talia after Sarah died? Had she been present when her mother was killed? How had she been transported? Where had she been kept? Where had she died? And why? Those questions would become central to the investigation. But there was another question underneath all of them. Was the same person responsible for both deaths? The possibility was obvious. The mother and daughter had disappeared together. Sarah was found dead. Talia was later found dead. The geographical locations and timing had to be examined. The investigators needed to know whether these were two separate crimes or one continuous chain of violence. If one person was responsible, then the case had to be reconstructed as a sequence. Not just a murder. Not just a disappearance. A sequence. The last known movements of Sarah. The disappearance of Talia. The discovery of Sarah. The search for Talia. The eventual discovery of the child. The movements of the suspect. The physical evidence. The digital evidence. The forensic evidence. Each piece had to be placed on the same timeline. And timelines are unforgiving. A person can lie about what they did. A person can lie about where they were. A person can deny knowing someone. But time leaves traces. A phone connects to a network. A camera captures a vehicle. A vehicle travels a particular distance. A biological trace remains where it should not be. A person's story may change. Physical evidence does not have the same ability to change its story. This is where the investigation began moving toward Edward Downey. But even then, police had to prove more than association. They had to establish a connection between Downey and the victims. And that meant examining the evidence at a microscopic level. The public often imagines forensic investigation as something dramatic. A detective finds one perfect fingerprint. A scientist looks through a microscope. A computer suddenly reveals the killer's identity. Real investigations are usually much slower. Evidence is collected, cataloged, tested, compared, retested. Its significance is evaluated alongside everything else. A DNA result may be powerful, but investigators still need to understand where the DNA was found, how it got there, and what it actually proves. A surveillance image may show a vehicle, but investigators still need to establish who was driving it. A phone record may show a location, But location data does not automatically tell a complete story. The strength of a case comes from the convergence of evidence. One fact supports another. One discovery explains another. The pieces begin to lock together. And in the Sarah Bailey and Talia Marsman investigation, that process would eventually point investigators toward Downey. But there was something else that made this case so disturbing. The victims were not strangers who happened to cross paths with violence. They were mother and daughter. Their relationship was part of the tragedy. Sarah was not simply an adult victim. She was Talia's mother. Talia was not simply another victim. She was Sarah's child. When one person was taken, the other was left vulnerable. And when the second person was killed, the crime became something even more devastating. It destroyed an entire family unit. That is why the search for Talia carried such emotional weight. People were not merely searching for a missing person. They were searching for the last remaining part of a family that had already been shattered. The investigators could not bring Sarah back. But perhaps they could still save Talia. For several days that possibility existed. Then it was gone. And the case entered its darkest phase. Now investigators had to work backward from death. They had to reconstruct what had happened to Sarah. Then they had to reconstruct what had happened to Talia. And then they had to determine whether the same sequence of events connected them both to Edward Downey. This is where a homicide investigation becomes almost mathematical. A location is connected to a time. A time is connected to a person. A person is connected to a vehicle. A vehicle is connected to another location. A location produces physical evidence. That evidence produces a forensic result. The forensic result connects back to a suspect. And eventually, investigators attempt to turn all of those fragments into one coherent narrative. But there is something deeply unsettling about that process. The more investigators learn about the victims' final hours, the less of their ordinary lives remain. Their final movements become more important than their favorite memories. Their last known locations become more important than the places they loved. Their last phone calls become more important than the conversations that came before. The crime consumes the biography. That is why it matters to remember Sarah and Talia as people rather than merely as victims. Sarah Bailey was 34. Talia Marsman was 5. Before the police investigation, before the media coverage, before Edward Downey's name became associated with their deaths, there was a mother raising a child. There were ordinary days. There were routines. There were plans. There were moments that did not seem important enough to remember. And that is how most lives are lived. We do not know which day will become our final day. We do not know which goodbye will become the last goodbye. We do not know which ordinary moment will eventually be examined by investigators trying to understand how everything changed. Sarah and Talia did not know. They could not have known. The people around them could not have known. But on that July day in 2016, their ordinary life was replaced by a mystery. Then the mystery became a search. The search became a homicide investigation. And the homicide investigation became a pursuit of a suspect. Edward Downey would eventually face the evidence collected by investigators. He would eventually stand before a court. A jury would eventually hear the case. And the justice system would eventually deliver its judgment. But none of that could change what had already happened. No verdict could return Sarah to her family. No sentence could give Talia the childhood she had been denied. No courtroom could recreate the future that had disappeared with them. That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of every homicide case. Justice can hold a person accountable. It cannot reverse death. The best it can do is establish responsibility, preserve the truth, and ensure that the victims are not forgotten. For Sarah and Talia, that truth would eventually be established through evidence. But at this moment in the story, there was still a question hanging over Calgary. Who had taken them? Who had killed Sarah? Who had killed Talia? And how could investigators prove it? The answer would not come from a confession. It would not come from a single dramatic revelation. It would emerge gradually, through evidence, through forensic examination, through the reconstruction of movements, through the patient work of investigators who had to take the final fragments of two lives and determine what they meant. And at the center of that emerging picture was Edward Downey, A man whose name would soon become inseparable from the deaths of Sarah Bailey and Talia Marsman. But before the courtroom, before the verdict, before the sentence, there was the evidence. And before the evidence, there was the crime. 2 lives. 1 mother. 1 5-year-old daughter. 3 days of searching. And a city waiting for a little girl to come home. She never did. The next stage of the investigation would begin with a question every detective in the case needed answered. What exactly happened between the moment Sarah Bailey disappeared and the moment investigators found her daughter? That question would lead them deeper into the final hours of Sarah's life. And the deeper they went, the closer they would come to the man they believed was responsible. There are moments in a murder investigation when the world seems to become very small. A city that normally feels enormous can suddenly be reduced to a handful of streets, a few locations, several names, and a narrow window of time. For investigators working the deaths of Sarah Bailey and Talia Marsman, that window began with a disappearance. A mother was gone. Her 5-year-old daughter was gone. And then Sarah was found dead. For a short time, investigators had been searching for a missing woman and a missing child. Now they were trying to understand a murder. Then came the discovery of Talia. 2 bodies. 1 family. 1 investigation. And a question that would not go away. What happened during the hours between the last moments of Sarah Bailey's life and the moment Talia Marsman's body was found? The answer mattered because the sequence itself could reveal the person responsible. If investigators could determine where Sarah had been, they might determine who had access to her. If they could determine where Talia had been taken, they might identify the person who transported her. If they could establish the movements of the suspect, they could compare those movements against the evidence. And if those separate lines converged on the same individual, suspicion could become something much stronger. Proof. But proof does not arrive all at once. It accumulates. It begins with small things. A piece of information that seems unimportant. A detail that does not fit. A location that places someone somewhere they claimed they had never been. A biological trace that connects a person to a place. A timeline that quietly contradicts a story. 1 detail can be dismissed. 2 can be explained. 3 can be coincidence. But eventually, there comes a point where coincidence becomes impossible to ignore. That was the challenge facing investigators. They were not simply trying to find a person who might have had something to do with the murders. They were trying to build a complete picture. And complete pictures require patience. The first step was Sarah. Who was she with during her final hours? Where had she gone? Who had seen her? What circumstances surrounded her disappearance? And what evidence had been left behind? The second step was Talia. A 5-year-old child cannot simply vanish without leaving a trail. Someone had to know she was there. Someone had to move her, if she had been transported. Someone had to make decisions about where she would go. And those decisions created opportunities for investigators to find evidence. The investigators were working against the clock, but the clock had already begun working in their favor in another way. Every movement leaves traces. Every journey has a beginning and an end. Every person who interacts with another person creates some kind of connection. The modern world records far more than people realize. Phones remember. Cameras remember. Vehicles leave traces. Digital systems remember times and locations. And human beings remember things too. Sometimes imperfectly. Sometimes inaccurately. But occasionally, one witness remembers a detail that becomes critical. The challenge is finding that detail. The challenge is separating what matters from what does not. The public often imagines detectives as people who immediately know which clue is important. Real investigations are rarely so clean. A detective may spend hours examining information that ultimately leads nowhere. A forensic technician may process evidence that produces nothing useful. A witness may remember something incorrectly. A lead may appear promising and then collapse. An entire investigative theory can be built and later discarded. That is what makes homicide investigations so difficult. The truth is there. But it is hidden inside noise. And in the case of Sarah and Talia, the noise was enormous. The public wanted answers. The family wanted answers. The media wanted answers. Investigators needed answers. But the evidence had its own timetable, and that timetable could not be rushed. While the investigation continued, the name Edward Downey became increasingly important. Downey's background meant investigators had reason to examine him closely. But being known to police is not the same thing as being responsible for a murder. That distinction would become important later. A courtroom cannot operate on instinct, cannot operate on reputation. It cannot operate on the feeling that a person looks guilty. The prosecution would eventually have to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. So investigators needed evidence capable of surviving that standard. They needed to show not only that Downey had some connection to the victims, but that the connection was meaningful. They needed to establish his movements. They needed to establish what he had done. And they needed to connect him physically and circumstantially to the deaths. That is where forensic evidence became so important. DNA is often described as if it were a magical fingerprint. It is not. DNA can tell investigators that biological material associated with one person is present in a particular place or on a particular object. But investigators still have to understand the circumstances. Where was it found? How could it have gotten there? When could it have been deposited? Was there an innocent explanation? What other evidence supports the interpretation? These questions matter because evidence is not simply collected. It has to be interpreted. And in the case against Downey, DNA would become one of the pieces investigators used to connect him to the events surrounding Sarah and Talia. But DNA was only part of the larger picture. The investigation also examined movement, surveillance, communication, vehículos, locations, witness accounts, physical evidence. Each piece helped answer a different question. Together, they could answer the question investigators cared about most. Who was responsible? The search for Talia had already demonstrated how quickly the case could change. At first, the public hoped she would be found alive. Then the discovery of her body changed the emotional landscape entirely. There was no longer a rescue operation. There was an accountability operation. The investigators now had to speak for a child who could no longer speak for herself. That is one of the most difficult responsibilities in a homicide investigation. The victim cannot explain what happened. They cannot identify the person who harmed them. They cannot correct a false accusation. They cannot tell investigators where they were. They cannot answer the questions that might otherwise make the case simple. Everything has to be reconstructed. For Talia, that reconstruction would be particularly painful because she was only 5 years old. At that age, the future is normally measured in simple things. School, family, friends, birthdays, games, stories, growing taller, learning new things, discovering the world. A 5-year-old should be thinking about tomorrow. Talia never got to see hers. And that fact changes the way the entire case should be viewed. The crime was not simply the destruction of a life. It was the destruction of a future. All the years that should have followed disappeared at once. For Sarah, there was also a future that disappeared. A future with her daughter. A future in which Talia would grow older. A future in which Sarah might watch her start school, graduate, make friends, become an adult. Those moments never came. And when investigators reconstructed the crime, they were reconstructing the end of that future. This is why true crime storytelling carries a responsibility. It is easy to focus on the killer. The killer has the mystery. The killer has the investigation. The killer has the courtroom. The killer's name appears in headlines. But the victims are the reason the story exists. Sarah and Talia should not disappear beneath the name of the person accused of killing them. Their names should remain at the center. Sarah Bailey, Talia Marsman, mother and daughter. Two people whose lives ended in the same terrible chain of events. As investigators worked, they began to assemble the pieces. The evidence surrounding Sarah. The evidence surrounding Talia. The movements of Downey. The forensic links. The circumstances surrounding the two deaths. And gradually, the theory of the case became clearer. Investigators believed the same man was responsible for both killings. The prosecution would later present evidence designed to prove exactly that. But the road from suspicion to conviction was still ahead. There would be hearings. There would be arguments. There would be scrutiny of the evidence. There would be questions about what the evidence actually proved. And eventually there would be a jury. Before that happened, however, investigators needed to establish one thing beyond doubt. The deaths of Sarah and Talia were connected. If they were connected, then the movements between the two crimes could become a map. And maps can reveal things. A person cannot be in two places at once. A vehicle cannot travel instantaneously. A phone cannot connect to a network without leaving information behind. A suspect's story must fit the physical world. When it does not, investigators notice. The smallest contradiction can become important. A timeline that is off by minutes. A location that does not match. A statement that changes. A physical trace that should not exist. That is how cases are often solved. Not with one spectacular clue, but with a series of smaller truths that refuse to disappear. In the Sarah Bailey and Talia Marsman investigation, those truths began pointing in the same direction, toward Edward Downey. But the investigators still had to determine exactly how. And they had to determine it carefully, because two people were dead. A child had been murdered. And the man who would eventually be accused of killing them would have to face the full weight of the evidence. There was no room for shortcuts. No room for assumptions. Every piece had to be tested. Every connection had to be examined. Every timeline had to be reconstructed. The case would eventually move beyond Calgary's streets and into a courtroom. But before a jury could hear the evidence, investigators had to transform scattered fragments into a coherent story. They had to answer the questions that had haunted the search. Where was Sarah? Where was Talia? Who had them? What happened to them? And why? The first questions were about location. The next questions were about movement. Then came identity. Then evidence. And finally responsibility. The investigation had begun with uncertainty. It would end with a verdict. But between those 2 points was a long, difficult journey through forensic evidence, witness information, surveillance, digital traces, and the reconstructed movements of the people connected to the case. At the center of that journey were 2 names: Sarah Bailey, Talia Marsman, the mother and daughter whose disappearance had brought a city together in search of a child. The child who was ultimately found dead. And the man investigators believed was responsible for both deaths. Edward Downey. The evidence against him would eventually be presented in court. But the courtroom was still in the future. For now, investigators were still working, still collecting, still comparing, still asking questions, still trying to understand what had happened in those final hours. And somewhere inside that evidence was the story of how a mother disappeared, how a little girl disappeared with her, and how both lives ended. The truth was not going to reveal itself in one dramatic moment. It was going to emerge piece by piece. And every piece would bring investigators closer to the same disturbing conclusion. Sarah had not simply vanished. Talia had not simply become lost. Their disappearance was part of a violent sequence. And someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep the truth hidden. But truth has a stubborn quality. It leaves traces. It survives in records. It survives in memories. It survives in physical evidence. And eventually it finds its way into a courtroom. For Sarah and Talia, that journey would take years. But it began in Calgary in July 2016, with a mother and daughter who disappeared, a city that searched for a little girl, and an investigation that refused to stop asking the question that mattered most. Who did this? And how could they prove it? Those questions would lead investigators deeper into the lives of Sarah and Talia. They would lead them toward Edward Downey. And they would eventually expose the evidence that transformed a terrifying disappearance into a case of double murder. But to understand that case, we first have to understand the people who were lost. Because before Sarah Bailey became a homicide victim, she was a woman with a life. And before Talia Marsman became a name remembered in a criminal case, she was a 5-year-old girl with a future. That future is where the next chapter begins. Calgary is a city that can make distance feel deceptive. From one part of the city to another, the landscape can change quickly. Streets and residential neighborhoods give way to commercial areas, open spaces, industrial corridors, and eventually the wide stretches of land that surround the city. In summer, the days can feel long, bright, and almost deceptively peaceful. July 2016 was that kind of summer. The city was alive. People were outside. Cars moved through neighborhoods and along the roads connecting Calgary to the communities beyond it. Families were making plans for the evening. Children were finishing another day of summer. Restaurants were busy. Stores were open. Traffic flowed through familiar intersections. Nothing about the city announced that a tragedy was unfolding. There was no visible boundary separating the ordinary world from the terrible events that would soon dominate headlines. That is often how violence enters a community. Not with a warning. Not with a siren in the distance. It arrives inside an ordinary day. And on July 12, 2016, Calgary was still an ordinary city. Sarah Bailey lived there. So did her daughter, Talia Marsman. For them, Calgary was not the setting of a future criminal investigation. It was simply home. It was where daily routines happened, where familiar streets became landmarks, where people knew where they were going without having to think about every turn, where a child could grow up believing that the adults around her would keep her safe. That sense of familiarity is important when understanding what happened next. Because a city is not only a collection of buildings and roads. For the people who live there, it is a map made from memory. A particular street means a particular friend. A particular neighborhood means a particular chapter of life. A particular intersection can bring back a childhood memory. Particular road can mean home. When investigators later began reconstructing the movements of Sarah, Talia, and the people connected to the case, those same streets became something different. They became evidence. Distances mattered. Travel times mattered. Locations mattered. A route that had once been ordinary could suddenly become part of a homicide timeline. That transformation is one of the strangest aspects of a criminal investigation. The physical world does not change. The meaning of the physical world does. A road is still a road. A house is still a house. A vehicle is still a vehicle. But once a crime has occurred, every ordinary object can acquire another meaning. A parking area can become a potential crime scene. A roadside can become a search location. A rural field can become the place where investigators discover the remains of a child. And a home can become the last known location of a woman who would never return. That was the world into which the investigation began. First, however, there was no complete picture. There was only Sarah. There was only Talia. And there was the question of what had happened to them. To understand why the disappearance was so alarming, investigators had to look beyond the simple fact that two people were missing. They had to understand the relationship between them. Sarah was Talia's mother. That meant Talia's whereabouts could not be treated as an unrelated mystery. If Sarah had disappeared voluntarily, why was Talia missing too? If Sarah had been taken, what had happened to the child? If Sarah had been harmed, who had access to Talia? Every possibility led back to the same central fact. The mother and daughter were connected. And someone knew that connection. The investigation would eventually reveal how important that relationship was. But in the early hours, police had to operate without the luxury of hindsight. They did not yet know which clues would matter. They did not know which people would become important. They did not know where the case would lead. They knew only that something was wrong. And they had to move quickly. The first task was to establish the known facts. When had Sarah last been seen? Where had she been? When had Talia last been seen? Who had spoken to them? What had changed in their normal routine? Had anyone noticed unusual behavior? Had there been an argument? Had there been a threat? Had Sarah expressed fear? Had she made plans? Had anyone seen a suspicious vehicle? These questions may sound simple. They were not. Every answer created another question. If someone had seen Sarah, investigators needed to know exactly when. If a witness remembered a vehicle, they needed to know its make, color, direction, and approximate time. If someone had spoken with Sarah, investigators needed to know what had been said. If a phone had been active, investigators needed to understand where and when. The investigation became a process of converting memory into chronology. And chronology is powerful. A vague statement such as "I saw her around that time" is not enough to reconstruct a murder. But a sequence can be. She was here. Then she went there. Then someone contacted her. Then her phone stopped behaving normally. Then she disappeared. Then a suspect was seen somewhere else. Then evidence was discovered. When those points are connected, a story begins to emerge. But there was another complication. The story had to account for Talia. A 5-year-old cannot move through a city with the independence of an adult. Someone had to know where she was. Someone had to be responsible for her. That meant the investigation could not simply follow Sarah's movements. It had to follow the child too. Every place where Sarah might have gone became relevant to Talia. Every person who might have interacted with Sarah became potentially relevant to the child's disappearance. And every piece of evidence had to be considered through that lens. The public, meanwhile, had only fragments. A missing woman. A missing child. Then the terrible discovery of Sarah's body. News coverage began to intensify. People saw Talia's photograph. They learned her name. They learned that she was 5. And for many strangers, the case became personal in an unexpected way. People who had never met Sarah could imagine what it meant to lose a daughter. Parents could look at Talia's photograph and imagine their own child. The search became more than an investigation. It became a collective act of hope. People wanted to believe that the little girl could still be found alive. That hope made the eventual discovery of Talia all the more devastating. But before that happened, investigators were moving through the city, collecting information and searching for patterns. Behind the scenes, homicide investigators were beginning to examine the people connected to Sarah. This is another difficult part of a murder investigation. The victim's social world must be opened. Relationships that were once private become relevant. Friends may be questioned. Acquaintances may be questioned. Former partners may be questioned. People with criminal histories may be examined. People who had arguments with the victim may be examined. Sometimes the killer is someone close. Sometimes the killer is someone barely known. Sometimes a person becomes suspicious because of evidence. Sometimes because of opportunity. Sometimes because their story does not make sense. And sometimes an apparently suspicious person turns out to have nothing to do with the crime. Investigators have to follow each possibility without allowing assumptions to determine the outcome. In the case of Sarah Bailey and Talia Marsman, that process eventually led toward Edward Downey. But the significance of Downey's name would not be fully understood immediately. There was still a large amount of evidence to collect. And there was still a city to search. One of the most important elements in any investigation is the physical environment. Crime scenes do not exist in isolation. They exist inside neighborhoods. They exist beside roads. They exist near businesses. They exist within networks of surveillance cameras, witnesses, vehicles, and ordinary activity. Every person who passed through an area may unknowingly become part of the investigation. Person walking a dog. A driver passing through an intersection. Someone entering a store. Someone leaving a building. Someone noticing a vehicle parked somewhere unusual. Most people would never imagine that what they saw for 10 seconds could later matter in a murder investigation. But investigators think differently. They ask questions about moments other people forget. Which direction was the vehicle traveling? What did the person look like? Was there anyone else inside? Did anything seem unusual? Did you see the vehicle again? The answers can be imperfect. Human memory is not a camera. But when several independent observations overlap, they can become powerful. And modern technology provides another layer. Surveillance cameras were becoming increasingly common. Phones created digital traces. Vehicles could be tracked through various records. Communication created timestamps. These systems did not solve the case automatically, but they gave investigators additional ways to test what people said. A suspect could tell one story. The records could tell another. A witness could remember a location. A camera could confirm or contradict it. A phone could place a person near a particular area. Each source had limitations, but together they created a more detailed map of the investigation. That map would become increasingly important as investigators examined Downey's connection to the victims. Still, there was a human dimension to the investigation that technology could never capture. The waiting. The fear. The uncertainty. For Sarah's family, The investigation was not an abstract puzzle. It was the disappearance of someone they loved. For Talia's family, it was the disappearance of a 5-year-old child. Every new police statement mattered. Every reported sighting mattered. Every rumor could create hope and then destroy it. Families caught in missing person investigations often experience a strange psychological state. They are grieving, but they cannot fully grieve. They are hoping, but they are afraid to hope too much. They are waiting for news, while knowing that the news could be devastating. They may replay the last conversation they had with the missing person. They may remember insignificant details that suddenly seem enormous. They may wonder whether they missed a warning, whether they should have called sooner, whether they could have done something differently. Those questions can survive long after an investigation ends. And in this case, the eventual answers would never change the central reality. Sarah was dead. Talia was dead. The question was who had done it. Calgary itself became part of the story. The city that had once represented home now contained locations associated with disappearance, investigation, and death. The search spread outward. Eventually, the investigation would reach beyond the familiar urban environment into rural territory. That movement from city to open land would become especially significant when Talia was found. The contrast was stark. A child who had disappeared from an urban environment was eventually discovered in a place far removed from ordinary family life. The location raised new questions. Why there? How had she been taken there? Who knew the area? Who had access to transportation? Who had the opportunity to move her? Every question narrowed the possibilities, and every answer potentially strengthened the connection to a suspect. The investigators were building a bridge between two worlds. The ordinary world in which Sarah and Talia had lived, and the hidden world in which the murders had occurred. The bridge was made of evidence, one piece at a time. The disappearance itself was the first piece. Sarah's death was the second. Talia's disappearance was the third. Her eventual discovery was another. Then came the forensic evidence, the surveillance, the movements, the digital records, the witness information, and eventually the name that would stand at the center of the prosecution's case: Edward Downey. But at this stage of the story, the investigation was still unfolding. No jury had heard the evidence. No verdict had been delivered. The case had not yet reached its legal conclusion. The city was still trying to understand what had happened. The families were still trying to absorb the loss. And investigators were still working to transform fragments into a narrative that could withstand scrutiny. That process would take time. Because the truth of a homicide is rarely found in one place. It can be scattered across a city. It can hide inside a phone record. It can sit unnoticed in a surveillance video. It can remain inside a biological sample. It can exist in a witness's memory. And sometimes it is found in the contradictions between what someone says and what the evidence shows. The investigators in the Sarah Bailey and Talia Marsman case had to search for all of it. Because they were not simply looking for a suspect. They were looking for an explanation. An explanation for why Sarah disappeared. An explanation for why Talia disappeared. An explanation for why both were dead. And an explanation that could eventually be presented to a court. The city had begun with uncertainty. It was now moving towards something more definite. A suspect. A forensic connection. A timeline. A theory of the crime. But before the investigation could reveal those pieces, there was something the audience needed to understand. Sarah Bailey and Talia Marsman had a life before the crime. They had routines. They had relationships. They had ordinary hopes. And those ordinary details matter because the crime did not happen in a vacuum. It happened to real people. A mother. A daughter. A family. Community. Two lives that should have continued. Two futures that should have unfolded. Instead, the summer of 2016 became the final chapter of both. And Calgary would remember them not because of what they did, but because of what was done to them. The investigation that followed would eventually expose the evidence against Edward Downey. But first, the story had to slow down. Away from police reports. Away from crime scenes. Away from forensic evidence. away from the name of the accused. It had to return to Sarah, to the woman she was before the headlines, and to Talia, the little girl whose life had barely begun. Because if we want to understand the full weight of what happened, we cannot begin with the killer. We have to begin with the people who were lost. And that is where the story of Sarah Bailey and Talia Marsman truly begins. By the morning after Sarah Bailey disappeared, Calgary had begun to feel different. The streets were still busy. The traffic lights still changed from red to green. People still drove to work, stopped for coffee, walked through stores, and went about the ordinary routines that make a city feel alive. But beneath that ordinary movement, something had changed. A woman was missing. Her 5-year-old daughter was missing with her. And investigators were beginning to realize that this was not a disappearance they could afford to treat casually. The name Talia Marsman began appearing in public appeals. A photograph of a little girl was placed in front of strangers and turned into a question. Have you seen her? For most people who encountered the image, it lasted only a few seconds. A child's face. A name. A description. But for investigators, that photograph represented something much heavier. A clock was running. Every hour mattered. Every possible sighting had to be checked. Every location had to be considered. Every person connected to Sarah had to be examined. The investigation was becoming a race against uncertainty. The first challenge was separating what was known from what was assumed. Investigators knew Sarah was missing. They knew Talia was missing. They knew something was wrong. But at that point they did not know exactly what had happened. That distinction is critical. The human mind hates uncertainty. When there is an unexplained disappearance, people naturally fill the empty spaces with stories. Maybe Sarah had left voluntarily. Maybe she was meeting someone. Maybe there had been a personal dispute. Maybe she needed time away. Maybe Talia was safe with someone else. But investigators could not afford to choose the explanation that felt most comforting. They had to consider the explanation that was most dangerous. The possibility that Sarah had been harmed. And if she had been harmed, the possibility that Talia was in danger too. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Sarah Bailey was found dead. The case was no longer about finding a missing woman. It was a homicide. And Talia was still missing. That combination transformed the investigation into an emergency. The search for Talia became the immediate priority. Investigators needed to find the child before anything else happened to her. The public was asked to watch for her. People were encouraged to pay attention to their surroundings. The image of Talia moved through the community. A 5-year-old girl. A child who should have been beside her mother. A child whose family was waiting for her to come home. For people outside the investigation, the case was frightening because the danger seemed invisible. There was no obvious threat standing in front of them. No known offender walking through the streets. No warning that could tell strangers where the danger was. Instead, there was a missing child. And the possibility that whoever had killed her mother might still have her. That possibility changed the way people looked at the city. A familiar street could suddenly feel unfamiliar. A parked vehicle could attract attention. A stranger could seem suspicious. A rural road could become a potential search area. Investigators, however, had to resist the urge to see danger everywhere. They needed facts. They needed reliable information. They needed to build a timeline. And building a timeline begins with the smallest details. When was Sarah last seen? Where? Who was there? What was she doing? What did she say? Where was Talia? What happened afterward? Was there a vehicle involved? Was anyone watching? Were there cameras nearby? Did Sarah use her phone? Did anyone contact her? Who knew where she was? These questions were asked again and again. Sometimes the same witness would be interviewed more than once. Not necessarily because investigators believed the person was lying. Memory changes. People remember things differently after learning new information. A witness may initially forget a vehicle because it seemed unimportant. Then, after seeing a photograph, they may suddenly remember its color. A person may remember a time as early evening when records show it was later. A detail that seemed meaningless on the first day can become important on the third. Investigators therefore had to build the timeline carefully. And the timeline was beginning to narrow. Sarah's final movements mattered. Talia's final known movements mattered even more. Because if investigators could establish when the child was last known to be safe, they could begin defining the window in which the crime occurred. That window could be measured in hours, sometimes minutes. And within that window, the suspect had to fit. This is where the physical geography of Calgary became important. A city is a network. One location connects to another. A person can move quickly between some areas and slowly between others. Traffic affects travel. Roads create predictable routes. Open spaces create different possibilities. Urban areas provide cameras and witnesses. Rural areas provide isolation. A person moving between these environments leaves behind different kinds of traces. Investigators had to think about all of them. The search for Talia eventually extended beyond the immediate urban environment. The city was no longer the only place being examined. The surrounding areas mattered too. Every road leaving Calgary could potentially become relevant. Every vehicle capable of carrying a person became part of the mental map. Every isolated area could be considered. But investigators also had to be careful. A search area can become enormous very quickly. Without reliable information, police could spend hours searching places that had nothing to do with the crime. The investigation needed direction. That direction increasingly came from evidence. And evidence began pointing toward people. One of those people was Edward Downey. Downey was not an unknown figure to law enforcement. His criminal history meant investigators had information about him before this case. But that alone was not enough. Investigators could not simply say that because Downey had committed crimes in the past, he must have committed these murders. They had to establish his connection to Sarah. They had to establish his connection to Talia. They had to establish his movements. They had to establish the physical evidence. And eventually, they had to establish that all of those facts formed one coherent story. This is where the investigation became more complex. A suspect can have a motive without committing a crime. A suspect can know a victim without harming them. A suspect can be near a crime scene without being responsible for the crime. Investigators have to distinguish between coincidence and connection. The question is not simply, was Downey connected to Sarah? The question is, how? And what did that connection mean? The evidence would have to answer those questions. Meanwhile, the public waited. The media continued to report on the search. People followed updates. The case became part of everyday conversation. Parents thought about their own children. People wondered how a 5-year-old could disappear. They wondered who could have taken her. They wondered whether she was still alive. For some people, hope became almost an act of resistance. As long as Talia had not been found, there was still the possibility that she could be saved. That hope was shattered on July 15th. Talia was found dead in a rural area near Calgary. There are moments in an investigation when a single discovery changes the meaning of every previous event. This was one of them. The search for a missing child was over. The investigation now involved 2 murders. And the victims were mother and daughter. The emotional impact was enormous. The public had been waiting for a photograph of Talia to be recognized. Instead, they learned that she had been found dead. The child everyone had been searching for was gone. And now the investigators had to answer a different question. Why? Why had someone killed Sarah? Why had Talia been killed? Was Talia a witness? Was she deliberately targeted? Was her death part of the same plan? What happened between the deaths? And how did the suspect move between the different locations? The investigation now had a structure. It had 2 victims. It had locations. It had a timeline. It had a suspect. And it had evidence. The next challenge was connecting those pieces. Forensic investigators began examining physical evidence associated with the case. DNA would become important. The science was not dramatic in the way movies portray it. There was no instant revelation. There was laboratory work, samples, testing, comparisons, documentation. The goal was to determine whether biological material could connect a person to a particular object, location, or victim. DNA can be incredibly powerful, but its meaning depends on context. Investigators had to understand how the material could have been deposited. They had to establish whether the connection was consistent with the prosecution's theory, and they had to combine it with other evidence. The case would not depend on one isolated fact. It would depend on convergence. The more independent evidence pointed toward the same conclusion, the stronger the case became. Surveillance footage could provide movement. Phone records could provide timing. Witnesses could provide observations. Physical evidence could provide contact. DNA could provide biological association. Each piece answered a different question. Together they could tell a story. And the story investigators were building increasingly centered on Edward Downey. But the legal system required another level of certainty. Investigators could believe they had identified the person responsible. Prosecutors could believe the evidence was strong. But a jury would eventually have to decide. That meant every investigative step mattered. Every piece of evidence could be challenged. Every interpretation could be questioned. Every witness could be cross-examined. Every timeline could be tested. The case had to survive scrutiny. That is why the investigation could not simply stop when police believed they knew who had done it. They had to keep working. Because the victims deserved more than an arrest. Their families deserved more than a suspect's name. They deserved an explanation. And the justice system demanded proof. As the investigation continued, the city slowly moved from shock toward anger. People wanted to know how this could happen. They wanted to know why Talia had been unable to escape. They wanted to know whether Sarah knew her killer. They wanted to know whether the tragedy could have been prevented. Those questions would remain painful because some of them could never be answered completely. A murder investigation can establish what happened without answering every question about why. A suspect can be identified. A conviction can be secured. A sentence can be imposed. But the emotional question of why someone chose to destroy another person's life can remain unresolved. This is particularly true when the victim is a child. People look for an explanation that makes the crime psychologically understandable. But sometimes the explanation is not satisfying. There may be no reason that makes sense to a normal person. There may be a mixture of motives, impulses, resentment, opportunity, or violence. And assigning a simple explanation can create a false sense of certainty. Investigators therefore had to focus on what could be proven. What happened? Who was there? What evidence remained? What could the science establish? What could witnesses establish? What did the suspects say? And did the evidence support or contradict that account? Those questions became the foundation of the case. The city outside continued functioning. But for Sarah's family, nothing was ordinary anymore. For Talia's family, the world had changed permanently. The investigation could move forward. Court dates could be scheduled. Evidence could be analyzed. But grief does not move according to a legal calendar. A family does not stop mourning because police announce an arrest. They do not stop missing someone because a prosecutor files charges. And they do not receive their loved one back when a jury returns a guilty verdict. Justice and grief occupy different worlds. The justice system asks what happened and who was responsible. Grief asks why the person is gone. The first question can sometimes be answered. The second may remain forever. The Sarah Bailey and Talia Marsman case would eventually provide an answer to the first question. The evidence would lead investigators toward Edward Downey. The prosecution would present its case. The defense would have an opportunity to challenge it. And eventually a jury would decide his fate. But before any of that happened, investigators had to finish the work. They had to turn a city full of scattered information into a sequence of events. They had to determine how Sarah died, how Talia died, how the two deaths were connected, and how Downey fit into that sequence. The answer would not be found in one dramatic moment. It would be assembled slowly, piece by piece. The city had begun with a missing woman and a missing child. Then came a body. Then another. And now there was a suspect. The investigation had entered its most critical stage. Because once investigators knew where to look, they could begin asking a more precise question. What evidence could prove that Edward Downey had been there? That question would lead them deeper into the forensic evidence. And eventually, The smallest traces left behind would become some of the most important evidence in the entire case. The city had searched for Talia. Now investigators had to speak for her. They had to reconstruct her final journey. They had to reconstruct Sarah's final hours. And they had to make sure that when the case finally reached a courtroom, the story would not depend on emotion alone. It would depend on evidence. That evidence would become the bridge between the tragedy that had shocked Calgary and the man who would eventually be held responsible for it. But before that bridge could be crossed, investigators had to return to the beginning. To Sarah. To the woman she was. To the mother she had been. And to the little girl whose life was inseparably connected to hers. Because the next part of the story would leave behind the police investigation for a moment. It would look at the two people whose lives had been transformed into a case file. Not as evidence. Not as victims. But as Sarah and Talia. A mother. A daughter. And two lives that should have continued far beyond July 2016. Before Calgary knew their names because of a homicide investigation, Sarah Bailey and Talia Marsman belonged to a much smaller world. Their world was not made of police reports or evidence bags. It was made of familiar rooms, familiar streets, family connections, ordinary routines, and the countless small moments that make up a life without anyone realizing those moments may one day become the memories people hold onto most tightly. Sarah was 34 years old. Talia was 5. A mother and her daughter. That description is simple, but it carries almost everything that matters about the relationship between them. For a 5-year-old child, the world is still largely organized around the people who provide safety. A parent is not simply another person. A parent is the person who knows where you belong. The person who knows what you need. The person whose voice can calm you when something feels frightening. The person who turns an unfamiliar place into somewhere familiar. For Talia, that person was her mother. And for Sarah, Talia was not simply her daughter. She was part of the future. Every parent carries an invisible picture of the years ahead. A child grows. A child changes. The little things become bigger things. A 5-year-old eventually becomes 6, then 7, then 10, then a teenager, then an adult. There are school photographs. Birthdays. First achievements. Arguments that seem enormous at the time and become funny years later. There are conversations that parents imagine having with their children when they are older. There are milestones that exist only in the future. For Sarah and Talia, that future was erased. But on the days before the murders, there was no reason for anyone to imagine that. Their lives were still moving forward. Calgary was home. The city was familiar. Summer was unfolding. And Talia was still 5 years old. That detail matters because 5-year-olds experience the world differently from adults. A child does not think about danger in the same way. A child does not understand every adult relationship. A child cannot evaluate someone's intentions the way an adult might. Trust is often immediate. A familiar face can mean safety. A familiar voice can mean everything is normal. That vulnerability is part of what makes the death of Talia so difficult to comprehend. She was not equipped to understand the circumstances that surrounded her. She was dependent on the adults around her. And when the person who should have been her strongest source of protection was killed, that protection disappeared. The tragedy of Sarah's death therefore cannot be separated from what happened to Talia. The two events are connected not simply by chronology, but by the relationship between the victims. A mother disappeared. Her daughter disappeared. Then both were found dead. That is the basic outline of the case. But outlines can make human lives seem smaller than they were. A police report can say female 34. It can say female child 5. Those descriptions are accurate. They are also insufficient. Because a person cannot be reduced to age and gender. Sarah had a life before the investigation. Talia had a personality before the headlines. There were people who knew their voices. People who recognized their expressions. People who knew what made them laugh. People who knew what worried them. People who expected to see them again. Those are the details that disappear when a human being becomes a case number. And that is why any story about Sarah and Talia has to begin by slowing down. Not with the killer. Not with the murder weapon. Not with the courtroom. With the lives that existed before violence entered them. Sarah was a mother trying to raise her daughter. Talia was a young girl growing up under her mother's care. That is the world we have to imagine before everything changed. Calgary itself becomes important here. A city can feel enormous to outsiders, but to a family it is often surprisingly small. There are places people return to again and again. Stores, schools, parks, neighborhood streets, friends' homes, familiar roots. The places become part of family memory. A child may not know the name of every street, but they recognize the journey. They know which turn comes next. They know where they are going. They know what the surroundings look like. That sense of familiarity is part of childhood. And then, suddenly, investigators had to use the same geography differently. The places that had once been part of Sarah and Talia's ordinary life became potential evidence. Where had they gone? Who had seen them? Which roads might they have traveled? Which locations mattered? Which people had crossed their path? The city became a giant timeline. Investigators were looking at it not as residents do, but as detectives. They were trying to turn geography into sequence. One place led to another. One movement led to another. One decision led to another. And somewhere inside that chain was the answer to the murders. But there was another element that made the case especially painful. Talia's age. At 5, a child's sense of time is still developing. A day can feel enormous. A week can seem impossibly long. Adults can explain that something will happen tomorrow. A child experiences tomorrow differently. That makes the idea of a 5-year-old disappearing especially terrifying. A child does not have the resources of an adult. She cannot simply decide to leave an unsafe situation and travel somewhere else. She cannot understand every warning. She cannot necessarily identify the danger. She depends on the people around her. And in this case, the person she depended on most was no longer able to protect her. The investigators who searched for Talia were therefore dealing with a terrible possibility from the beginning. If she was still alive, she might be completely dependent on whoever had taken her. That meant the search could not wait. The public response reflected that urgency. People were asked to pay attention, to remember the child's face, to report information, to look carefully. A photograph that might otherwise have remained inside a family album became a public image. Thousands of strangers were suddenly looking at the face of a 5-year-old they had never met. They were looking for her. They were hoping to recognize her. And for a brief period, the photograph carried the possibility of a reunion. That is what makes the discovery of Talia so devastating. The photograph had represented hope. The reality became loss. The search did not end with the child being brought home. It ended with the discovery of her body. At that moment, the city had to confront something that many people had been trying not to imagine. The worst possibility had become reality. And now there were 2 victims. The investigation also had to confront another reality. The person responsible had not simply killed an adult woman. A child had died too. That fact would eventually become central to the legal proceedings. But long before a jury heard arguments, investigators had to understand the relationship between the 2 deaths. They had to determine whether the crimes were part of one continuous event. They had to reconstruct the movements between them. They had to identify the person responsible. And they had to gather evidence strong enough to support a prosecution. This is where the name Edward Downey became increasingly significant. Downey's history meant investigators already had information about him. But history is not destiny. A past criminal record does not prove a new crime. Investigators needed something specific. They needed evidence tying him to Sarah and Talia. They needed to establish his movements. They needed to establish his contact with the victims. They needed to establish what happened after the disappearance. And they needed to demonstrate that the evidence did not merely place him somewhere near the case. It connected him to the murders. That distinction would become one of the most important themes of the entire investigation. Suspicion is easy. Proof is difficult. A person can look suspicious. A person can have a troubling past. A person can give an uncomfortable answer. None of those things alone establish guilt. The justice system requires more. That requirement would shape everything that followed. For investigators, the task was therefore both emotional and technical. They had to deal with the horror of what had happened while remaining precise about what could actually be demonstrated. They could not allow outrage to replace evidence. They could not allow the public demand for answers to push them toward a premature conclusion. They had to build the case carefully. The evidence would eventually include forensic material, surveillance information, digital traces, and other circumstances connecting Downey to the victims. Each piece would matter. But the most important thing was how those pieces fit together. A murder case is a story reconstructed from fragments. The victim cannot tell the story. The suspect may tell a version that benefits him. Witnesses may remember only parts. Physical evidence may be incomplete. Technology may provide information without explaining what it means. The investigator's job is to bring those fragments together, to ask which facts are independent, which facts corroborate one another, which facts contradict the suspect, which facts can be explained innocently, and which facts cannot. The stronger the overlap, the harder the explanation becomes to dismiss. That is how a case moves from suspicion toward proof. But Sarah and Talia were not waiting for that process. Their lives had already ended. Their families had already entered a different reality. For people who loved them, there would be no return to normal. The investigation could continue for months. The courtroom could continue for years. Evidence could be discussed. Arguments could be made. A verdict could eventually be reached. But grief does not disappear when the legal process ends. There is a particular cruelty in losing someone through violence. The death itself is devastating. But there is also the knowledge that another person chose to cause it. Families may spend years trying to understand that decision. Why this person? Why them? Why then? Why in this way? Sometimes investigators can establish motive. Sometimes they can establish opportunity. Sometimes they can establish exactly what happened. But why can remain more complicated. A motive may explain a decision without making it understandable. And in the case of Talia, there is an additional layer of incomprehension. Whatever adult conflict or circumstance existed around Sarah, a 5-year-old child had no meaningful role in the world of adult criminal decisions. She was simply a child. Yet she became a victim. That is one reason the case continues to resonate. It is not only a story about murder. It is a story about vulnerability, about trust, about the terrifying consequences that can occur when an adult chooses violence and a child becomes caught within it. The case also demonstrates how quickly an ordinary environment can become the setting for something extraordinary and terrible. Calgary did not become a different city because Sarah and Talia were murdered. The streets remained. The buildings remained. People continued living their lives. But for the families involved, the city had changed permanently. A familiar place could suddenly trigger memory. A road could bring back the final days. A photograph could bring back the child. A date on the calendar could bring back the moment everything changed. July would forever carry a different meaning. That is the hidden geography of grief. A city contains places that are visible to everyone and memories that belong only to certain people. For the investigators, locations became evidence. For the family, those same locations could become reminders. And for the public, they became part of a case they would remember for years. But the investigation still had work to do. The discovery of Talia meant that police could stop searching for her physically. Now they had to search for the truth. That search required the reconstruction of both victims' final movements. It required examination of physical evidence. It required understanding Downey's connection to the victims. It required the careful analysis of DNA and other forensic evidence. It required investigators to determine whether the suspect's movements matched the evidence. And eventually, it required prosecutors to present the entire sequence to a jury. The case would have to survive one question after another. Was Downey connected to Sarah? Was he connected to Talia? Was there evidence placing him in relevant locations? Could the physical evidence be explained another way? Did the timeline make sense? Did the different pieces support one another? And could the prosecution prove that he was responsible for both murders beyond a reasonable doubt? Those questions would dominate the legal phase of the case. But before that came the investigation. And before the investigation could become a courtroom narrative, it had to remain a search for truth. The investigators were not simply looking for a man to arrest. They were trying to tell the story of two people who could no longer tell it themselves. That responsibility is easy to underestimate. Every mistake can matter. Every overlooked detail can matter. Every assumption can matter. A missed piece of evidence can change a case. A false lead can waste precious time. A premature conclusion can send an investigation in the wrong direction. So the investigators had to keep asking questions, even when they thought they knew the answer. Especially when they thought they knew the answer. Because the goal was not to prove what they believed. The goal was to establish what had actually happened. And gradually, the evidence began forming a picture. Sarah's disappearance. Talia's disappearance. Sarah's death. Talia's death. The movements connected to both. The physical evidence. The forensic evidence. The emerging connection to Edward Downey. The pieces were no longer floating independently. They were beginning to form a sequence. And a sequence can become a case. Still, the most important part of the story remained the two people at its center. Sarah Bailey. Talia Marsman. A mother and daughter who should have had decades of ordinary life ahead of them. A mother who should have watched her daughter grow. A daughter who should have grown up remembering her mother through years of shared experiences, rather than through a tragedy that ended both of their lives. Instead, their lives became connected forever by the worst possible event. The story of Sarah cannot be told without Talia. The story of Talia cannot be told without Sarah. And the story of the investigation cannot be told without remembering that both were human beings before they became victims. That is where the next chapter begins. Away from the suspect. Away from the evidence. Away from the courtroom. Back to Sarah Bailey. Who was she? What was her life like? What did motherhood mean to her? What was Talia like as a child? What did the people closest to them remember? Those questions matter because a victim's life should not begin at the moment of death. Sarah's story began long before July 2016. Talia's story began long before her photograph appeared in a missing child appeal. They had lives. They had relationships. They had memories. They had futures. And then, in the summer of 2016, all of those futures were taken away. The investigation would eventually identify the man held responsible. The courts would eventually deliver justice. But before we follow the evidence to the accused, we have to remember exactly what was lost. A 34-year-old mother. A 5-year-old daughter. 2 names. 2 lives. 1 family. And a city that would never forget the summer when they disappeared. Before Sarah Bailey became the center of a homicide investigation, she was simply a woman living her life in Calgary. Before Talia Marsman became the photograph that an entire city searched for, she was simply a 5-year-old girl. There is a danger in telling a true crime story that begins with the moment of death. The language of investigations naturally reduces human beings to facts. Age, location, date, cause of death, evidence, victim number 1, victim number 2. But Sarah was never a victim number. And Talia was never a case file. They were a mother and daughter. That relationship is the heart of this story. Sarah was 34 years old when her life was violently taken from her. Talia was only 5 years old. An age when the world is still supposed to be expanding. A child at 5 is only beginning to understand how large life can become. There are still so many things ahead that an adult takes for granted. More birthdays. More school years. New friends. New places. New fears. New discoveries. The gradual realization that the world is much larger than the rooms and streets a child already knows. Talia never reached any of those years. She never became 6. She never became 7. She never had the opportunity to look back on childhood from the distance of adulthood. And Sarah never had the opportunity to watch her daughter grow into the person she might have become. That is what was taken from them. Not simply a life. Not simply a future. An entire collection of ordinary moments that would otherwise have happened naturally. For Sarah, motherhood meant that her life was connected to another human being in a particularly profound way. Talia depended upon her. The two shared a bond that existed long before anyone outside their family would ever hear their names. The public would eventually know them because something terrible had happened. Their family knew them because of everything that had happened before the tragedy. That difference matters. When a person disappears, strangers often learn only the information necessary to identify them. A photograph, an age, a name, perhaps a physical description. But a family remembers something else. They remember a voice. They remember a laugh. They remember expressions. They remember habits. They remember the little details that would never appear in a police bulletin. And those details are often the things that make a person impossible to replace. In the case of Sarah and Talia, the surviving family and people who knew them were left carrying those memories after the two were gone. The tragedy did not erase who they had been, but the circumstances of their deaths threatened to overshadow their lives. That is why their story deserves to slow down here. Sarah Bailey was a mother in Calgary. Talia Marsman was her 5-year-old daughter. Those facts may sound simple, but imagine the ordinary rhythm behind them. A child wakes up. A mother begins another day. There are meals. There are conversations. There are plans. There are things that have to be done and things that can wait. There are moments when a child asks a question that seems insignificant to an adult, but is enormously important to the child. There are moments of laughter. There are moments of frustration. There are moments when a mother is simply trying to get through another busy day. This is what life looks like before tragedy. Nothing announces that it is about to become history. That is one of the cruelest things about murder. The final ordinary moments are rarely recognized as final. A person does not know that the last conversation will be the last. A child does not know that a normal day will become the boundary between the life before and the life that never comes. Sarah and Talia could not have known that their names would soon be repeated across Calgary. They could not have known that strangers would look at photographs of them. They could not have known that investigators would spend countless hours reconstructing their final movements. They could not have known that their lives would eventually be discussed in a courtroom. For them, life was still happening. Until suddenly it wasn't. The available information about Sarah's personal life is not extensive enough to reconstruct every detail of her personality or every ordinary moment she shared with her daughter. That is important to acknowledge rather than fill the gaps with invented stories. True crime storytelling can be powerful without pretending to know things that cannot be known. We do not need to invent a favorite song Sarah listened to in the morning. We do not need to create imaginary conversations between mother and daughter. We do not need to describe fictional family traditions. Those details might sound emotional, but they would not belong to Sarah. They would belong to the storyteller. What we do know is enough to understand what was lost. Sarah was 34. She was Talia's mother. Talia was 5. They lived in Calgary. And on a day in July 2016, both disappeared. That disappearance would expose just how vulnerable their lives had become. For investigators, the relationship between them immediately mattered. If Sarah was missing and Talia was missing too, then the two disappearances could not reasonably be treated as completely separate events. The child was dependent upon the mother. The mother was responsible for the child. Their movements were connected. Their safety was connected. Their fate was connected. And when Sarah was found dead, the meaning of Talia's disappearance became even more frightening. Investigators were no longer looking for a woman who might have chosen to leave. They were looking for a missing 5-year-old whose mother had been murdered. The distinction was enormous. A missing adult may have the ability to make decisions, travel independently, contact someone, seek help, or communicate where they are. A 5-year-old does not have the same ability. Talia was vulnerable in a way that made every passing hour more frightening. The people searching for her did not know whether she understood what was happening. They did not know whether she was frightened. They did not know whether she was alone. They did not know whether the person responsible for Sarah's death still had access to her. And that uncertainty transformed the search. A photograph of Talia began circulating publicly. People who had never met the child were suddenly looking at her face. They were asked to remember her, to notice her, to report anything that might help locate her. For a brief period, hope still existed. Perhaps she would be found. Perhaps someone would recognize her. Perhaps she was somewhere safe. Perhaps there would be a moment when the investigation ended not with another tragedy, but with a child being returned to her family. That possibility was what people held on to. Then July 15th arrived. Talia was found dead in a rural area near Calgary. The news